And so they have to be, presented with the shame of leaving their children and trying to get to safety. Right. So there's that whole judgment, and the judgment, I mean, judging the whole system, the being tried and persecuted many times in many different ways, and being re-victimized in that loaded word of judgment and shame.
Yeah, and I think that's, one of the great things that also, even if it's just social media activism, but also like hashtags like Me Too and campaigns like yours, I think one of the great things that those initiatives do is they make us less ashamed, of what happened to us. And I think that's just so important.
Oh, absolutely, Beatrice. It's, that is why I applaud movements like Me Too, because if it does nothing more than to give others a voice.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, and that's what the whole concept is about, Me Too. This has happened to me too. And it relegates a voice for women, particularly who remained voiceless because they were ashamed of being judged. Even when some of the initial survivors came forward right after the Me Too, because Me Too has been around, I understand, for a decade now. I think it just sort of found its legs with this latest controversy that came out with some of the controversial stories that came out earlier in the year. And even when some of the women came forward, and particularly some of the celebrity women, they were being judged. They were being asked, and questioned, well, why did you wait till now? You were protecting your career. You just thought about the money. You just thought about, why did you wait 10 years now? And that is why, because they were being judged. And that was that was a perfect example of what I meant by linking shame to judgment.
And we will be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Fur was founded by Laura Schubert and Lillian Tung, two women who believe in natural, beautiful care for every part of the body, for everybody.
For everybody and every body.
Yes, both. For everybody and every body.
Because you know what? What you do with your body is your business.
Yes.
And bottling the cleanest and most effective ingredients for your body is their business.
Yes. And if you're interested in trying any fur products, check out their website, furyu.com. That's FURYOU.com. And get 15% off with the code PERSIST15.
Now, one thing I think that everyone listening now wants to know is, what are warning signs for intimate partner violence or coercive control or stalking? Are there any stories that come up over and over again that you now know are red flags in the beginning of a relationship, for example?
One that is often very prevalent as a early sign, and I'll use my own personal experience and story, was that this person was very charming and engaging and knew how to reel me in, that by the time I was in it, I didn't even realize I was stuck. Right. And so, but what I also have noticed, and what it's also very common in the stories that I hear, is that whole honeymoon phase of when the first time we saw something. I mean, the first sign doesn't happen when that first strike of, a fist, or the first strike of a name calling, or the first attempt at stalking. That first sign happened when in the small pit of your gut, the way that person looked at you or said something that just didn't feel right. And you're like, wait a minute, did I hear that right? I know I heard it, but did I really listen to it? Did I listen to the words, the meaning beneath the words? And oftentimes, especially we as women, we listen to the words and don't dig deeper for the meaning. And so many people want to say, oh, the first sign came when he hit me, or when he called me the B word, or when, he stalked me. Oh, no, the first sign came when we first saw or heard those words, or that moment where we felt like something just isn't right in this. I know it. I believe it. I feel it. But I'm going to allow myself to think about this in a way that I'm in a new relationship, or I'm back in it again, or whatever, and I want to give it the benefit of the doubt. And it's that doubt that ultimately could lead, unfortunately, to the minimum of 3 women that are murdered every single day.
Yeah.
Or the countless number of women that are sexually violated, in an intimate partner situation. I know sexual crimes come unexpectedly, but it usually is in those early warning signs.
So you say it's a lot about trusting your own gut.
It's about trusting your own gut. It is so about trusting your own gut. And when I speak, I don't speak from a place of judgment. I speak from my own personal experience.
Yeah.
I speak from 5 generations, and I speak from, the times where my daughter, when I first met the boyfriend and she brought him home, and I looked at him and I'm looking at her and I'm like, do you not see what I see?
Oh, yes. I know that feeling so well from friends of mine, and
like, why am I seeing this, but you're not seeing it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because she's looking through eyes of love. She's looking through eyes of shame. She might be looking through eyes of, where she is in that journey that she's not ready to see. The average number of times, for example, Beatrice, that a woman returns to her abusive partner is minimally 7 to 9 times. So you ask yourself, well, why does it take 7 to 9 times? Because, and I remember, I had come to the realization with my own daughter that when I mentioned at the top of the discussion, I said, I had to move her 3 different times to 3 different states. It was after that 3rd time, and he kept showing up wherever I moved her to.
Jesus Christ.
Yes. I come to realize, wait a minute, how is he finding her?
Yeah.
Well, he's finding her because she's reaching out to him as well.
Oh, yeah.
And so I said to myself, until she is ready, she's not ready yet. So she's still in that journey. And I don't want to judge her, even though as a mother I did, because as a mother, you're all those motherly and maternal instincts kick in.
Yeah.
And even though I didn't want her to, feel judged, or shame her, at some point I finally had to say, until she is ready to move on, then I can move her to all 50 states.
Yeah. But this also means that a lot of times perpetrators of violence are very, very good manipulators, right?
Yes. And that's what I was talking about earlier when I spoke about, when I'm looking at my daughter and she's bringing him home, and I'm like, do you not see what I'm seeing? I'm seeing manipulation. I'm seeing control. I'm seeing jealousy. I'm seeing scars on your face, right? And they might not be physical scars. It's just in the way she looked at him at that point, right? Of fear. And so yes. And I would go on to say, and I don't by any way mean to minimize physical violence, but I would go on to say that it is that emotional and psychological violence that is even more damaging sometimes than physical violence, because those scars never heal. Physical scars may heal. All of it is terrible. And that is because the manipulation, the humiliation, there's a term called gaslighting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which means, for your audience, when somebody try to make you think you're the crazy one, or you're the one that's causing me to do this to you, Or you're the problem and not me.
Or it never happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is that stuff that is part of manipulation?
Now, one woman that I really, really admire is Laura Richards. I don't know if you know her. She also has a podcast, and she talks a lot about, she's a criminal behavioral analyst for Scotland Yard, and she also has a podcast, and she talks a lot about coercive control. And she says the same thing that you just said, which is a lot of time the violence is not physical but psychological, and it's just as bad. And a lot of times physical violence, comes after a lot of psychological violence. So a lot of times the coercive control comes before the physical violence.
Yes, and there's a chart that's, and I might get the term wrong, but it's like escalation chart that shows how violence escalates. And first it starts very subtly, and it starts with the control and, not wanting you to be around your friends or your family, or then the jealousy. Then it goes into the manipulation and the humiliation, and then the verbal abuse. And by the time it got to physical, because I've yet to hear a story where someone got involved in a relationship, and then on the first time that she or he noticed, that it was an abusive situation, was when they struck him. Right? Yeah. The striking comes much later. And what I mean by much later, I mean all of these. That doesn't mean in terms of a timeline much later. It could mean that there was so many other things that were going on, with the verbal abuse, the psychological abuse, the humiliation, the manipulation, the control, the jealousy, that by the time the physical violence has come on, it could be in a week span. I'm not saying it's less or longer time. I'm just saying that by the time the physical comes, there's been a whole other number of things that have been going on. Mm-hmm. And that is why I think we need to start with greater public education and prevention and breaking the silence, because, and quite frankly, many women in particular don't even realize that they're in an abusive situation. Especially like in my family, that was our norm. Yeah. That was our norm. I didn't know any different. That was, with my grandmother, my mother saw of my grandmother. That's what I saw to some extent of my mother, but I was very young when my biological father passed away when I was only 5 years old. So I got to see two sides. I got to see, and I wrote a blog about this, about the two sides of my mother's story that I saw in the relationship with my father, my biological father, who was murdered when I was 5 years old. But in that story, I remember the scars. I remember the blood. I remember, the atrocities of what a little girl would never forget, certain things that happened with my biological and mother and my biological father and mother. Then my mother, after my father was killed, would later marry my stepfather, who was the complete opposite. And in the nearly 40 years that they were married, until she passed away, I don't recall the number of times, if any, that I ever even heard or seen him raise his voice to her, let alone his hand. So I saw what a healthy and unhealthy relationship looked like. But by the time it got to my generation, it was more about me wanting to be with the popular boy.
Okay.
Right? And keeping it quiet and silenced because of the shame of telling my friends and my family and my mother in particular, who, I remember the first time I came home with a black eye, I was only 16 years old. And I was very active in sports and stuff. And so my mother said to me in her Southern dialect, that was even more fearful of me than of him. I was more fearful of her than of him. And she said, "That boy ain't putting his hands on you, is he?" Now, how do you respond to that at 16? I mean, if I say yes, I'm not going to be able to have a boyfriend anymore.
Yeah.
He's going to be disappointed in me.